I love doing research. I love the role of researcher. It's a little like being an investigator. I spend hours gathering information and going over it. I love it. Research has taken me to South Africa twice, to Ghana for almost 6 months, Cote d'Ivoire, Costa Rica, and Cuba. I have traveled to England, Paris, and Krakow, Poland, and I am not done yet. So to be able to combine two of my loves, research and Unitarian Universalism, is like a dream come true. Research can lead to such interesting information and help us better understand whatever our subject matter is. And in this instance, it's Unitarian Universalism. And you know that my great interest is the presence of Black Unitarian Universalist women and girls. And yet at one point I was really interested in the role of women, UU women, in the civil rights movement. And of course, most of us are familiar with Viola Liuzzo. But I wondered what Black UU women responded to the call. And to my delight, I discovered Margaret Moseley. She was a Black Unitarian Universalist from Barnstable, Massachusetts, and a lifelong activist. She arrived in Selma in 1965. Remember, the Selma to Montgomery marches took place on March 7th to March 21st. It was a 54-mile march along the highway to the state capital of Montgomery. A few days after the march, Margaret Moseley arrived with a group of Unitarian Universalist women from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Margaret Moseley was 63 years old and suffered from arthritis, which prevented her from participating in the march. She visited the Liuzzo family and actually shared their reflections about their beloved mother and wife. And while in Selma, Moseley was well received by Blacks and reviled by segregationist whites, not surprisingly. I consider myself a research activist, and you might wonder, how is that different from just a researcher? Much of my original training taught me to be detached from my subject matter, my research, so that we were considered to be neutral and not to contaminate or compromise the research. An activist researcher knows that that's bullshit. And we're engaged, and it's impossible to be neutral, and especially when you're coming with an agenda which is to shed light on the inequalities and the injustices, and to imagine and think about how to create a more livable and just world. We grapple as research activists with some universal questions, and we think about how underlying social relations create events and experiences, and how we can generate deep causal explanations. So we are involved in the research. As a research activist, I use various methodologies to really explore some complex relations within social institutions and systems, asking questions to help us understand human behavior and to change oppressive contexts and relationships. So we have a connection, a relationship with the research and with subject matters. As an activist researcher, I'm coming with an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and multicultural lens, looking at the data, looking at the research. A research activist is also grounded in the motivation to produce knowledge that encourages a collective learning process. This isn't just about me as the researcher learning. This is about the community that I'm doing research in conjunction with. It's about research that is going to benefit the community. For instance, a community may need to know why the water source is polluted rather than investing fiscal and human resources into, for instance, the migratory patterns of grasshoppers or butterflies. So that's another aspect of a research activist, and that is accountability. We recognize also the legitimacy of knowledge production beyond academia. In other words, academia isn't the only source of knowledge that, as activists, researchers, we're accountable to communities, and particularly marginalized communities, who may need our services, who may need the skill sets that we have to help them understand the nature of their oppression and the sources, so on and so forth. I once conducted a very short but informative interview with Roberta Wilson. She told me that when Dr. King came to Chicago in the late 1960s, 1965, as a matter of fact, none of the black churches would host him. You see, they were afraid of potential violence. And who hosted him? Third Unitarian Church. So Roberta Wilson came to hear Dr. King speak. She stated, "I was curious about these white folks that hosted him. They asked me to join, and I told them I didn't know. I'd have to think about it. I was already radical, but I got worse when I came to Third Unitarian." Miss Wilson came and stayed for over 50 years as an active member of Third Unitarian Church. I am so glad I got a chance to meet her and to hear her stories before she died. Two of my most adventurous experiences included Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and the Women's Resource Center in Cape Town, South Africa. Having obtained a small grant from the Fund for Theological Education around 2009, I traveled to Philadelphia after exchanging emails with the librarian at First Unitarian Church. I witnessed documents that were signed by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. One was for her pew rental, you know, the benches that they sat on. She paid $5 a year for a pew that she shared with another individual. They keep that document in a safe. I then traveled to Eden Cemetery, where both she and her daughter are buried. Interestingly enough, that section is named after John Brown. It so happens that she was a friend of John Brown, and when he was incarcerated, she stayed with his wife for the duration of his trial. She sent him money. She wrote him. I also visited Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, where she shared dual membership with First Unitarian Church. I was a little disappointed and surprised that they weren't familiar with her, and they had no evidence of her presence in any of their displays and exhibits. While I was there in Philadelphia, I visited the local museum, and on the outside of the building was a huge banner across the entire building advertising the exhibit on Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And upon entering, a bigger than life-size replica of her. You push buttons and it would give you history and information about her life. It was very exciting. I also went on a tour where the park rangers talked about the noted abolitionists in the area, and I was surprised she was not included. So I talked with the park ranger, later sent him information that he promised to include in future tours about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. So field research can be the source of great adventures. So I mentioned South Africa, Cape Town, South Africa, the Women's Resource Center. So I'm there transcribing notes about violence against women and children, what kind of violence, what the legal remedies are, so on and so forth. This was, I believe, my second day, and I was on a deadline of trying to get as much information as possible before going on to other organizations. It was nearing 5 p.m., which was closing time, and staff was starting to leave. I looked up, and the very last staff person said, "Just lock the door on your way out." I was so excited. It's like I can stay. Not only did I stay, I stayed overnight. I left right before staff returned the next morning. Congregational research is important, and research can take us into so many different realities and worlds. I view the congregation and individual lives as an important source of knowledge and information. A research activist considers ways for communities of people to be involved in and to act in ways that empower them as change agents to transform inequalities and injustices. We look for ways to invite you into the research process. Hence, the Congregational Archival and Research Project, a pilot program partnering with the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Atlanta to research the congregational presence of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, trans, non-binary, and disabled members, with a focus on Black women and girls. Teaching basic research skills to laypersons to explore and document their congregational history of BIPOCs introduces a process to capture the stories and history of BIPOCs. Perhaps you recognize the value of your individual and collective stories, but many congregants around the country don't really understand and appreciate the value of their stories. And the premise of this research project is, if we want Unitarian Universalist history to reflect an inclusive narrative, and in order for that to happen, then we have to represent the presence of BIPOCs within that narrative. And in many instances, that will mean us having to get in there and unearth those stories. Sometimes there are primary sources available. Sometimes there are archives and libraries. Other times we have to conduct interviews and focus groups in order to generate that information. The process will be documented so it can be replicated in other UU congregations. Biographies that surface will be vetted and submitted to the Dictionary of UU Biographies for publication online. So you see, we're looking at all aspects. We might develop some electronic portfolios, and certainly we're going to generate some PowerPoint presentations and videos. We expected to develop stories for directors of religious education to be used in Stories for All Ages, for a worship service devoted to research as storytelling and resistance. This project was conceived after 28 years of research on my part on Black women. I realized it was time to change the focus and methodology. Instead of continuing to devote time to historic personalities, which I think we've done a good job in exposing foremothers like Maria Louise Baldwin, educator, administrator, and lecturer who joined the Unitarian Church of Disciples in Boston. And in 1895, she helped to organize a conference of representatives from Black women's clubs that led to the founding of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in 1896. One of her partners in that work was another Black Unitarian, Florida Ruffin Ridley. editor, journalist. She was a member of Second Unitarian Church in Brookline, Massachusetts. In my opinion, it's time to invite the voices of those women and girls of color that have come into Unitarian Universalism through our doors, that have been born into Unitarian Universalism. Furthermore, I think individuals like myself and Mark Morrison Reed, this is bigger than the two of us or a handful of researchers. Lay persons like yourself can be trained to value and harness these stories, and hence this project was conceived. While several congregations have similar kinds of projects, this one is unique in that we're replicating, we're teaching others how to do what we're doing. So with a handbook and a video developed to allow others to in fact replicate their own research projects is a plus. One of the goals is to really instill the importance and awareness of congregational BIPOC's presence and history, and also to we want to promote an appreciation for congregational history, and particularly that of BIPOCs. You might ask the question, so how does this enhance and grow Unitarian Universalism? I think that any research that allows Unitarian Universalists to shift the telling of the history from famous historic personalities and reminds us that everyday ordinary folks like you and I are indeed the history makers. And then also this research project sends a loud, clear message to UU BIPOCs that they matter and that they are seen, which is an important goal, I think. Today is our official launch of the Congregational Archival and Research Project. We anticipate completion in September 2022. Besides myself, John Leaker will be involved. He is with Meadville Lombard Theological School. He is the Director of Library and Archives, and the Reverend Joe Cherry, who is a historian and the interim minister at UU Congregation of Falmouth. We're partners with UUCA. And this is the call to action. We're looking for a few good folks that are interested in participating in this research project. If you're interested, then contact me at Rahman at sistersource, sistersource.org. And I hope that you are as excited about this research project as we are. Thank you. Ashe, blessings, and may it be so.